All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about feminist perspectives on science. And right off the bat, we got to kind of clarify what we're talking about here. Because when you hear feminist perspectives, it's easy to jump to just thinking about women in science. But this deep dive goes way beyond just counting the number of women in labs. This is something much more fundamental.
Absolutely. We're really going to be tackling the philosophical underpinnings of science, and we'll use the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on this as our guide. But just to give you a roadmap, we're going to be hitting on some key areas. First off, the whole issue of equity in science, think representation, who gets studied, all that.
Right, like leveling the playing field, so to speak.
Exactly. But then we're going to get into some really interesting critiques of scientific methodology itself, how our assumptions about gender, maybe even without us realizing it, shape how science gets done. And that takes us into deep philosophical territory like epistemology and even ontology.
Oh, we're going there. This is exciting. All right, so let's start with the basics. Equity in science. I mean, historically, women have been largely excluded from scientific fields. Has that changed?
Well, it's definitely changing, but let's look at the numbers. As of 2024, women make up about 35% of the STEM workforce. So, yeah, progress, but still a long way to go.
35%. So we're not exactly talking about equal representation here.
Nope. And early feminist scholarship, they really keyed in on this. They started these Women Were These projects. It was about highlighting the contributions of women scientists throughout history, contributions that were often overlooked or minimized.
Right, because if you're missing from the history books, it sort of reinforces the idea that, hey, this isn't a field for you.
Exactly. It's like this implicit message gets sent. Science is a male domain. And that has a huge impact, especially on young girls. Think about the whole concept of stereotype threat.
Yes, stereotype threat. That's a big one. For those who aren't familiar, can you give us a little philosophy 101 on that?
Sure. So imagine you're aware of a negative stereotype about your group. Say, girls are bad at math. Now you have to take a math test. Being aware of that stereotype can actually make you anxious, which then messes with your performance, potentially confirming the stereotype. It's a vicious cycle.
Oh, I've totally been there. Like you start second-guessing yourself and it just spirals.
Yeah.
So how do we combat that? How do we break out of that cycle?
Well, one way is to show counterexamples. If you see successful women in science, it challenges that stereotype. It shows girls, hey, this could be me. I can do this. It disrupts that ingrained narrative.
So representation matters.
Yeah.
Having those role models, showing what's possible.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about historical exclusion, the impact of stereotypes, but what about the arguments that get thrown around to explain the lack of women in STEM? Like, oh, it's just innate differences, or women just prefer different fields. What do feminist thinkers say about that?
Well, feminists don't deny that there are workplace inequities. That's real. But they're very critical of those other explanations. When it comes to the innate differences argument, they point out that a lot of the research that supposedly supports that is biased or doesn't account for social factors.
Right, like maybe girls aren't encouraged to pursue math and science as much as boys are. So how do you even tease apart nature versus nurture in that situation?
Exactly. And then there's the whole differing preferences argument. Feminists push back on that too. They say, hold on, what we call preferences are often shaped by societal expectations and the limitations placed on women.
So it's not necessarily that women don't want to go into STEM, it's that they've been steered away from it their whole lives.
Right. And there's solid research that backs this up. The American Association of University Women, or AAUW, they put out these reports like Why So Few and Solving the Equation. They basically debunk those conventional explanations.
So they're looking at the data, the actual experiences of women in STEM.
Yes. And they find that there are biases in research, that stereotypes affect how girls see themselves and their options, and there are still significant workplace inequities. They even highlight these things called micro-inequities, subtle things that create a hostile environment for women.
Right, like being talked over in meetings or having your ideas dismissed. It's death by 1,000 cuts. And it's not just a feeling. There are real consequences, right?
Absolutely. The 2018 consensus report on sexual harassment in academia, that really brought this home. It showed that sexual harassment is a huge problem in science and engineering, and it drives women out of these fields.
So it's not just about making science more welcoming, it's about safety, about basic respect. And I think this ties into our next point. It's not just about getting more women into science, but about how science itself is done, like what gets studied, who gets studied. This brings us to the idea of science is studying women, right?
Yes, and for a long time, the default subject in science was male. If you look back, there are all these gaps in research because no one was really studying women's lives, their bodies, their experiences.
It's like women were invisible in a lot of scientific fields.
Yeah, and this has had real consequences. Take economics, for example. Traditional economic models didn't even account for domestic labor, which is historically done mostly by women. It's like this whole huge part of the economy was just ignored.
Because it wasn't seen as real work,
Right.
because it wasn't paid.
Exactly. And even when fields like economics do try to include gender, it can be really hard to shake off these ingrained theoretical frameworks, like rational choice theory, for instance.
Can you break that down a bit? How does that factor into this?
So rational choice theory assumes that everyone acts in their own self-interest to maximize their own benefit. It's all about individual choices. But it often doesn't consider how those choices are constrained by social structures, by things like gender roles and expectations.
So it's kind of assuming everyone has the same freedom to make choices, when in reality, that's not always the case.
Right. And even behavioral economics, which tries to add some nuance to that, can fall into similar traps. They might acknowledge that people don't always act rationally, but they can still rely on stereotypes about how men and women behave.
So the underlying assumptions are still there, shaping the research.
Mhm.
And we see similar things happening in medicine, right? Like the historical neglect of heart disease in women.
Oh, absolutely. For a long time, heart disease research focused primarily on men. They were the default.
Yeah.
So we didn't really understand how heart disease presents in women, how the symptoms might be different.
And that's had really serious consequences for women's health.
Yes. And it's amazing how long this kind of thinking has persisted. Even though the NIH has required the inclusion of women in research since 1993, there are still issues with making sure women are adequately represented, and that research really takes into account their specific needs.
So it's not just about adding women to existing research. It's about questioning the whole framework, the assumptions that are baked into it.
Exactly. And you see this in other fields, too. Even in political science, a field that's all about social structures, they sometimes miss the mark when it comes to gender.
Really? How so?
Well, Pamela Paxton, she did this study on democracy indices. These indices are supposed to measure how democratic a country is. But she found that a lot of them were using universal suffrage as an indicator, but they were really just talking about men's suffrage.
So women's right to vote wasn't even considered in measuring democracy.
Yeah, in a lot of cases. And when she factored in women's suffrage, it actually changed the rankings. It changed our understanding of how democracy developed.
That's a pretty big oversight. So this brings us to the core of the feminist critique of science. It's not just about fixing biases here and there. It's about questioning the whole enterprise, right?
Right. It's about recognizing that even if we get rid of all the overt sexism in science, there are still deeper, more subtle ways that gender can influence how science gets done.
And a lot of this comes down to unexamined assumptions, right? Assumptions about how the world works, about what's important to study, about what counts as evidence.
Exactly. And these assumptions are often so ingrained, both in individuals and in entire scientific communities, that it can be really hard to even see them, let alone challenge them.
Right? It's like the water we swim in. We don't even realize it's there.
And this ties into the whole debate about the value-free ideal of science. This idea that science should be completely objective, free from any moral, political, or cultural values.
Yeah, that's been a big one in philosophy of science for ages.
Right. But feminist philosophers of science have really pushed back on that. They've shown how values inevitably influence the whole scientific process, from the questions we ask to how we interpret the data.
So it's not about trying to eliminate values altogether. It's about being more aware of which values are at play and whether they're justified.
Right. And it's also recognizing that bias isn't just a matter of individual prejudice. It can be built into the very structure of scientific institutions and disciplines.
So even if every individual scientist was completely unbiased, we could still have biased science.
Exactly. And that means we need to look at the methodologies, the theories, the dominant paradigms in different fields. We need to ask, are these frameworks themselves skewed in ways that perpetuate gender inequality?
So even if we were to do traditional science better, follow all the rules perfectly, we might still end up with a limited, biased understanding of the world.
Right. And that was a big point of contention during the science wars back in the 90s. Critics accused feminist science studies of being anti-science, of undermining objectivity and leading to relativism.
Oh yeah, the science wars. That was a heated debate.
It was. But feminist philosophers of science really pushed back against those accusations. They said, look, we're not saying anything goes. We're not against objectivity. In fact, we think that paying attention to gender and other social factors can actually make science more objective, more rigorous.
So they were arguing for a different kind of objectivity, one that took social context seriously.
Exactly. And within feminist philosophy of science, there are different approaches to how to do that.
Yeah.
One approach is feminist empiricist holism.
Can you unpack that a bit? What's that all about?
Sure. So this approach draws on American pragmatism. It's very grounded in the actual practices of science, and it's very committed to the idea that ultimately experience is the test of our beliefs. But it also emphasizes that scientific beliefs are tested as a whole, as a web of interconnected ideas.
It's not like you test one hypothesis in isolation. It's all connected to a bigger theoretical framework.
Right. And a key concern for feminist empiricist holists is figuring out how to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate uses of values in science.
Because they acknowledge that values are there, but they want to make sure that they're not distorting the science.
Exactly. And Elizabeth Anderson, she makes the argument that values are legitimate when they're held non-dogmatically, when they're open to revision based on the evidence.
So you can have values, but you can't be so attached to them that you ignore evidence that challenges them.
Right. And she uses Abigail Stewart's research on divorce as an example. Stewart was very open about her feminist values. She saw divorce not just as a tragedy, but as a process of adjustment. And that perspective actually led to a more empirically sound understanding of divorce because it allowed her to see a wider range of outcomes.
So her values, instead of biasing the research, actually made it more nuanced and accurate.
Exactly. And Sharon Clef makes a similar argument. She shows how the feminist value that gender matters actually improved research on the hygiene hypothesis. By considering gendered norms of cleanliness, researchers were able to better understand why boys and girls might have different rates of autoimmune diseases and allergies.
So those feminist values actually led to a more complete picture of the phenomenon. But I'm guessing this approach isn't without its critics, right?
Right. Miriam Solomon, she points out that this idea of legitimate uses of values can be a bit tricky. Like, who gets to decide which values are legitimate? And Audrey Yopp raises concerns about values that might not be very responsive to empirical evidence. Like, what do you do with those?
So it's an ongoing philosophical debate. And it kind of ties into the whole question of objectivity, which is another central issue in feminist philosophy of science.
Yes, and objectivity is a really tricky concept. As Elizabeth Lloyd points out, it's not the simple, straightforward thing. The traditional view of objectivity, this idea of the detached knower observing the world from a neutral standpoint, that's been challenged by feminist thinkers.
Because they argue that there's no such thing as a truly neutral standpoint, right?
Yeah.
We all come to science with our own baggage, our own values, our own experiences.
Exactly. And when we talk about objectivity, we often assume that reality is completely independent of us, that it's just out there waiting to be discovered. But feminists push back on that. They say, look, the way we understand reality, the concepts we use, the questions we ask, those are all shaped by our social context, by things like gender.
So our understanding of reality is always filtered through our social lens.
Right. And that means we need to be more aware of those filters, more critical of them.
And this brings us to the distinction between neutrality and impartiality, right?
Yes. Neutrality means that scientific theories should be free from any non-epistemic values. So they shouldn't be promoting any particular moral or political agenda. Impartiality, on the other hand, means that theory should be judged solely on the basis of empirical evidence and established epistemic values.
So you can have a theory that's neutral in the sense that it's not explicitly pushing any particular value, but it can still be biased in subtle ways.
Right. And Sandra Harding, she argues that impartiality is crucial for objectivity, but she also recognizes that some value judgments can be empirically grounded.
So it's not like values and evidence are always completely separate.
Exactly. And Helen Longino, she takes a different approach. She focuses on the social processes of science. She says that objectivity comes from having a community of scientists who can critically evaluate each other's work, who can challenge each other's biases.
So it's a collective process of checking and balancing, rather than relying on the neutrality of any individual scientist.
Right. And this brings us to feminist standpoint theory, which is one of the most influential and also most debated ideas in feminist philosophy of science.
Okay, let's dive into that. What's the core idea behind standpoint theory?
So standpoint theory starts with the idea that all knowledge is situated. It's produced from specific social locations that are shaped by power relations. So where you stand in society, your gender, your race, your class, all of that influences how you see the world, what you consider important to study, even what you recognize as evidence.
So our social position, our standpoint, shapes what we know and how we know it.
Exactly. And the second part of standpoint theory is the idea of epistemic advantage. It argues that people from marginalized groups, people who are oppressed or excluded, can sometimes have a better understanding of how power works, of how society is structured.
Because they see the world from a perspective that's often ignored or dismissed by those in power.
Right. And Patricia Hill Collins, she uses the term outsider within to describe this. It's like being a member of a marginalized group, but also having to operate within the dominant culture. It gives you this double vision, this ability to see things that others might miss.
So it's not just that marginalized people have different experiences, it's that those experiences can give them unique insights into the workings of power and oppression.
Exactly. But standpoint theory also emphasizes that this epistemic advantage isn't automatic. You don't just get it by being marginalized. You have to work for it. It takes critical reflection. It takes collective analysis. It takes a commitment to understanding your social location in relation to systems of power.
So it's not just about personal experience, it's about a conscious, critical engagement with that experience.
Right. And this brings us to Sandra Harding's concept of strong objectivity. She argues that by taking standpoint seriously, by incorporating the perspectives of marginalized groups, we can actually achieve a stronger form of objectivity.
So it's not about pretending to be neutral. It's about actively seeking out those perspectives that are often excluded and using them to challenge our own biases.
Exactly. And Alison Wiley adds to this by saying that standpoint can also help us figure out which epistemic virtues are most important in a given research project. So things like empirical adequacy, explanatory power, coherence, those are all important, but their relative importance might vary depending on your standpoint on what you're trying to achieve with your research.
So it's not just about having the right values. It's about recognizing that different values might lead us to prioritize different aspects of good science.
Right. And Kristen Intamin, she's argued that feminist empiricism and standpoint theory actually have a lot in common. They both recognize that knowledge is contextual, that values play a role, and that science is a social process.
So there's more overlap than people might initially think.
Yes. And then you have newer scholars like Brianna Toole who are offering fresh perspectives on standpoint theory. She makes a distinction between epistemic advantage, which is based on your social location, and epistemic privilege, which is something you achieve through conscious effort, through raising your awareness and developing a critical perspective.
So even people who aren't directly marginalized can develop a standpoint by engaging with the experiences and perspectives of those who are.
Right. And Charles Krasnow has talked about the importance of dialogue and political action in helping us figure out what counts as relevant evidence. He sees this as a way to bridge the gap between different standpoints and create a shared understanding of what we're trying to achieve with our knowledge.
So it's not just about individual researchers having the right perspective. It's about creating a community of inquiry that's committed to social justice and epistemic responsibility. And this whole discussion of feminist standpoint theory is just one part of a much broader and evolving field of feminist science studies.
Absolutely. And within that field, you have newer approaches emerging, like queer science studies and the new materialisms, which are building on and extending the insights of earlier feminist scholarship.
So how does queer science studies fit into this picture?
Well, queer science studies takes the feminist critique of gender even further. It challenges the very idea of a binary between male and female, and it questions what we consider normal or natural when it comes to sex, sexuality, and gender.
So it's disrupting those taken-for-granted categories that we often use to understand the world.
Right. And thinkers like Anne Fausto Sterling and Sarah Richardson, they've done a lot of work showing how these assumptions about sex and gender have actually shaped scientific research in problematic ways.
Like, they've shown how gender stereotypes have influenced our understanding of biology, even at the cellular level.
Exactly. And then you have people like Sari Van Anders who are developing new scientific theories that are more inclusive and nuanced, that take into account the diversity of human experiences. Her sexual configuration theory, for instance, moves beyond the traditional focus on sexual orientation and looks at a much wider range of factors to understand sexuality.
So queer science studies is both critiquing existing science and developing new ways of thinking about these issues.
Exactly. And then you have the new materialisms, which are coming at this from a different angle. They're challenging the traditional emphasis on representation in feminist theory. And they're saying, look, we need to pay more attention to the material world, to how bodies and matter shape our experiences.
So it's not just about how we think about the world, it's about how our bodies, our materiality, are part of that world.
Right. And Karen Barad, she's a key figure in this movement. Her idea of agential realism basically says that matter is not just passive stuff that we act upon. Matter is active, it has agency, it shapes the world in ways that we're only beginning to understand.
That's a pretty radical shift in perspective.
Hmm.
And I think it speaks to how feminist science studies is constantly pushing boundaries, constantly challenging us to rethink our assumptions.
Absolutely. And it's not just limited to biology and the social sciences. We're seeing feminist perspectives influencing other fields too, like neuroscience and cognitive science.
So neurofeminism, for instance, that's a whole area of research that's looking critically at how neuroscience has been shaped by gender bias.
Right. And Rebecca Jordan Young, she's done some really important work in this area. She's challenged a lot of the assumptions about sex differences in the brain, particularly those based on the brain organization theory, which says that prenatal hormones determine how our brains develop.
So she's arguing that it's not just about hormones, it's about how social factors like gender expectations interact with our biology.
Exactly. And in cognitive science, you have Cordelia Fine, who coined the term neurosexism to describe the tendency to use flimsy evidence about brain differences to justify gender stereotypes.
So she's calling out the bad science that's often used to reinforce those stereotypes.
Yes. And she's critical of approaches like Simon Baron-Cohen's theory about empathizing versus systematizing brains, which he claims explains why men are supposedly better at math and science.
And again, the feminist critique is not saying that there are no differences between male and female brains. It's saying, let's be more rigorous, let's be more critical of the evidence, and let's not jump to conclusions about gender differences without considering all the other factors that might be at play.
Exactly. And recent research has actually challenged some of those long-held assumptions about the so-called maleness of testosterone. Studies have shown that testosterone levels can be influenced by behavior, by social context. So it's not just a one-way street from biology to behavior, it's much more complex than that.
So all of this really highlights how feminist perspectives on science are not just about adding women and stirring. It's about shaking things up, challenging the foundations, forcing us to rethink what we know and how we know it.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that gender is not just a variable that we can control for in our experiments. It's woven into the very fabric of science, and it shapes the way we understand the world.
And as we've seen, this is not just an abstract academic debate. It has real-world implications for how we conduct research, how we interpret data, and how we use science to make decisions about policy, healthcare, and social justice.
Right. And the field is constantly evolving, constantly pushing the boundaries of our understanding. And for our listeners who are interested in learning more, I highly recommend checking out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on feminist perspectives on science. They have a great list of additional readings that can take you deeper into all of these fascinating areas.
Yeah, there's so much more to explore. And for our philosopher listeners out there, I want to leave you with a final thought. If we take seriously the insights of feminist science studies, it means we need to rethink some of our most fundamental philosophical concepts.
Right, like rationality, evidence, truth.
Exactly. What would a truly gender-aware philosophy look like?
Yeah.
How would it change the way we think about knowledge, about the world, about ourselves? That's a question worth pondering.
And it's a question that feminist philosophers of science are continuing to grapple with in really exciting and challenging ways.
So keep those philosophical gears turning. And we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.